China's tightening grip on rare earth exports is stirring old fears of supply shocks and price spikes. But this time, the playbook looks more precise and the stakes even higher. To unpack the risks and realities facing global markets today, I'm joined by Ryan Castilloux, founder of Adamas Intelligence, a leading voice on critical mineral strategy as well. Ryan, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Ryan, China's dominance over rare earths mining and processing didn't happen overnight. Can you briefly map out how they came to control so much of the global supply, and why has it been so hard to challenge that hold?
Sure. Great point. So ironically or not, the U.S. was in fact the largest producer of rare earths at the beginning of the previous century. In the 80s and 90s, China began to increase its own production and flooded the world with low-priced rare earth elements, which ultimately put a lot of its competitors, namely the Mountain Pass mine at the time, out of business. And it leveraged that upstream dominance over the past 3 decades to build out its dominance downstream over the steps from mine through to magnets and more recently into motors, EVs, and all the different end uses of rare earths.
There has been growing instability in Myanmar, a key rare earth supplier to China, Ryan. I'm wondering, how is that conflict affecting China's own processing industry, and how state-controlled is the rare earth sector today?
Yeah, so we often think of China as holding the world's largest rare earth reserves, and that is true, but not all rare earth reserves are equal. So in China's case, the vast majority of the rare earth reserves that it holds in the ground are so-called light rare earth elements, and its heavy rare earth element reserves are much more depleted. So over the past 5 to 7 years or so, China has outsourced much of the heavy rare earth production growth to neighboring Myanmar, where they've been mining and producing rare earth concentrates, exporting those to Chinese processors, who then produce rare earth oxides, rare earth metals, magnets, and so on. So since 2021, there's been a coup ongoing in Myanmar, which has presented a great deal of uncertainty, has made those flows from Myanmar into China extremely volatile, and more recently has reached a point where mining operations have more or less stopped. The control of the mining regions in Myanmar have been overtaken by resistance groups or independence forces, and those flows from Myanmar to China have virtually plummeted since last October. So amidst the trade war that we're in today and all of the uncertainty that brings, Myanmar is exacerbating issues even further, given that from 1 month to the next, looking forward, we're not sure how much material will be mined and how much will make its way to Chinese processors and ultimately into magnets, EVs, and so on.
So there are 17 rare earth elements that aren't truly rare, yet alternative supply chains have lagged for decades. Why has the world been so slow to diversify, and where do you see meaningful ex-China progress now?
Yeah, the lure of low-priced rare earths from China has been intoxicating over the past 3 years, and that has led to a growing reliance on China for supplies of magnets and other upstream rare earth materials. Today, that is becoming a major issue. It worked in a more globalized world. Today, it's obviously a huge hurdle with China restricting exports of those materials in just as of this month. So there are hundreds of exploration and development projects outside of China that over the past 15 years or so have been advancing and aiming to be future alternative rare earth producers to China. The challenge has been that as I mentioned, the allure of the low-priced rare earths from China has dissuaded investors in the past decade from jumping into projects, largely over concerns that China controls prices, that it can hold prices low, and undermine the economics of these aspiring producers. With the pandemic that hit us in 2020, that opened up the eyes of end users and governments in the West to the fragility of supply chains, not just on a geopolitical front, but also on a acts of God front, if you will, And that began to blow wind into the sails of efforts to diversify supply chains, which are now being accelerated and frankly galvanized amidst the tit for tat that we're seeing with China and the US today.
Well, deals like the Ukraine-US Critical Minerals Pact and new finds in Greenland, for example, they're making headlines. How significant are these developments, and can trade policies like tariffs really shift the rare earth balance?
Yeah, with respect to Ukraine, I think that situation has been largely overblown in the media for reasons that it's really being echoed from the top down in the U.S., which raises a lot of interest. Not to say that there aren't rare earth deposits or occurrences in Ukraine, but what is known about them, they pale in comparison to a lot of other projects globally. Greenland, as you mentioned, is host to some of the world's largest rare earth resources globally. But some of those have become hot potatoes. They've become contentious in recent years with the flip-flopping of government policies in the nation with respect to the permissions around mining of rare earths and uranium that on occasion comes out of those deposits as well. So that has become a great interest of the U.S. They view Greenland as a strategic resource, as a strategic location. But quite frankly, there are more advanced projects around the world, some that are putting bricks on the ground today and building themselves out. So I would encourage anybody watching to not just focus on the headline projects and to familiarize yourself with the array of different projects that are in existence and advancing globally.
Back to China as I wrap up, Ryan. You've charted how China's 2010-2011 export restrictions caused a historic spike in rare earth prices. What were the main drivers back then, and do you see a repeat scenario unfolding now?
Yeah, looking back at 2010, 2011, that historic price spike that we saw, a 2 order of magnitude increase in prices, is often attributed to China cutting off Japan for rare earth supplies. But in fact, when we look back at that period, there were many forces that culminated and resulted in that price spike, one of which was indeed the halt of exports to Japan. What really pushed that escalation was initially that China had reduced its export quotas for over 5 years. So at that time, China would tell its producers and suppliers how much material they're allowed to ship to foreign consumers. With that number coming down steadily for 5 years straight, that was creating a lot of concern amongst end users who themselves were seeing their own demand growing. At the same time, China reinserted or reinjected export taxes on those same materials that were leaving. And that started a lot of speculation about what the future would hold. How much would China continue to decrease exports while increasing taxes on those materials? That led us into September 2011, when the geopolitical tiff between Japan and China came to a peak. China halted exports to Japan. And ironically or not, the price actually stayed flat for 3 months or so after that period. But when trade reopened, that sparked a period of panic buying, with end users realizing just how exposed they were and wanting to stock up immediately on material, which really poured fuel on the fire and pushed prices to that historic peak that we often see charted. This time around, as you alluded to, things are appearing to be different. China has since imposed or put in place a traceability database in the country where it can track every ton of material from mine through the middle of the value chain and into the various end uses and end users around the globe. So whereas with Japan, it was a blunt force sledgehammer, if you will, of a supply stoppage, this time around, China has really positioned itself to be much more surgical and to inflict pain on specific industries, specific end users, or regions that it wishes to. And I think the obvious target at this moment would be geographically the U.S. and specifically its defense industry, but also those dual use industries that produce both commercial and defense related applications like drones and the like. So the restrictions from China on exports of rare earths have just come onto the table this month, and that necessitates that end users apply for or that suppliers in China apply for an export license to be able to ship those materials to end users around the world. And today we're looking at a 45 business day window for those licenses to be approved or not. So we are in a holding pattern. We're waiting to see the extent of how much China will restrict those exports ultimately. But so far for the US and specifically for its defense industry, it looks to be very concerning.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Well, thanks very much indeed for those insights there, Ryan Castilloux, the founder of Adamas Intelligence and, of course, a leading voice on critical mineral strategy. Ryan, thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much.